and welcome to today's talk on climate justice and the role of business. I'm Kathleen, and I'm responsible for environmental sustainability here at Mozilla. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Samantha Harris, who will be sharing her ideas and insights from years and years of experience with environmental sustainability with us. And I had the chance to work with Sam over the last few months, and I can't emphasize enough how much I appreciate her dedication and knowledge when it comes to community resilience and paying attention to the disparate impacts of the climate crisis on different parts of the global population. So today she'll be sharing some of that work with all of you. And before we kick it off, I just want to say a few brief things on logistics before I turn it over to Roxy, who's similarly excited to welcome Sam here today. So this talk is already being live streamed on YouTube and Air Mozilla, and we're also recording it. So if you do not want to be on camera, please make sure you're face muted. And there will be time for questions at the end. And I'll be monitoring our Slack channel on #speaker/series. And of course, you can also ping me directly if you prefer that. And also really, please do not be shy. Sam has a wealth of knowledge to share with us. So do make sure you tap into that. And in case we don't get to answer all of your questions, I'm sure we can also follow up async afterwards. So with that, Roxy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. So I've been involved in environmental work in the context of business over the last 20 years. But my thinking changed last year when, the beginning of this year, actually, wow, time flies, when I met Sam in Berlin at our Berlin All Hands. The conversation at that time with Sam made me think about the last 100 years of our, industrial evolution was really focused on the 20%. All the money, all the opportunity, all the privilege went to the 20% of the people, 20% of the corporations. Therefore, we have very large companies, we have very large tech platforms we have today. So for us to be sustainable, for us to go, be able to really put this planet, profit, and people together, and we talk about our sustainability in the next 20 years as an emergency, we have to think about the 80% of the people, how things can go to them, how capital, how opportunities can go to them. So it's a path forward. So I'm really excited to continue to learn from Sam today, and I hope you enjoy the talk as well. So as Kathleen said, she has a wealth of experience, practical, academic, and very much focused on the people in the environment. And I really encourage you to have a great conversation today. Thank you. Sam, take it over.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathleen and Roxy. And I'm super excited to be here. I was saying here when I logged in, it's just climate justice, or just justice in general, is sort of my passion, especially when it comes to the environment. So hopefully this will be, I'll be able to give you at least a taste of what, but I'd love to just at least give you an overview of what it is and how business, why it's important for business, and why, how business can start acting on this. If you could go to the next slide, please. So again, this is just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. I think I just covered it. We can just go ahead and get started with the next slide. And one more. So just quickly, for those of you that don't know BSR, I just wanted to give you a quick overview. We are a global nonprofit business network, and with nearly 270 member companies. We work with many different other companies and partners, including Mozilla, which Kathleen, you already mentioned. We have a mission to build a just and sustainable world, and that centers everything we do. We work across many, actually, it's really difficult to even cover sort of like where we're coming from, but we work across all areas of expertise when it comes to sustainability, corporate sustainability. So climate change is really just a very small piece of what we work on, but we dive into human rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion, women's empowerment, supply chain elements, across the board with lots of different industries and partners, as I mentioned, and you can see here across the globe, we have 8 different offices, but that even those offices don't really limit sort of where we have a footprint. But again, this is just a taste of what we do. Next slide, please. And essentially what we do is really work with business on sustainability, from moving on the what to the how, and really around just implementation. So for example, you can see here the Paris Agreement in 2015. We help companies implement what the Paris Agreement goals set out to do. We help implement the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Women's Empowerment Principles, and those are just a few of the sort of international global either treaties or agreements, or just the norms that are happening that we help to help business figure out and help really implement that within business strategy to create sort of the systemic change that we need to that we know needs to happen within business itself. And you can go to the next slide, please. And so we'll just really dive into what climate justice is. I know we have limited time, and one of the things that we do at BSR is we also try to translate emerging trends, things that might not be, you know, the norm for business to understand. And climate justice is exactly one of those things that's really spotlighted right now with everything that we're seeing. So we'll go on to the next slide. And so this is just sort of setting the scene. I feel like I have to tell any of you that we're in the midst of this sort of significant social, economic, and cultural transition that has been unbelievably exacerbated and accelerated by the unprecedented events that we have been seeing this year in 2020, namely the pandemic, the social justice movements across the globe. These are really, it's really important to understand the sort of scene that we're in right now, because it's increasing and accelerating the momentum for the platform that climate justice has to stand on right now. The first 2 decades of the 21st century have also been marked by rapid technological innovation, economic volatility, rising income inequality. Roxy, you mentioned some of this already, but really how we're seeing this rising income inequality and demographic and cultural change, and how business interacts with that, and the new business models and work arrangements that we're seeing. So those are just some of the elements, and of course the climate crisis, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. And so what's really important to know is just that these the interconnectedness of all of this, and the profound change that is ongoing and continues to sort of exacerbate the inequality challenges that we see today. I just want to add that really, like, we're starting to see this sort of intersection with diversity, equity, and inclusion, in which, you know, the ways that race and gender and sexual orientation, among many other facets of identity and sort of axes of oppression, shape what's happening today, and how crises are experienced just differently or disproportionately. Next slide, please. And so what is climate justice? What does that even mean? It really looks at prioritizing the people and communities that are most affected by the climate crisis, and also the least responsible for it. And whether this be by climate disasters that we see today, like forest fires in California, the hurricanes and typhoons, different names for extreme weather events across the globe, drought and flooding, even to the energy transition itself. And so really how that is affecting people and communities, even right up to the climate solutions that we're putting forward. Again, so this sort of intersection with diversity and equity and inclusion is really what's bringing climate justice into the spotlight right now. And for the conversation today, it might be that my focus and the focus largely sits with what's happening in the United States, but I just want to say that it is a global issue, and it does look different across regions, across countries, across states, provinces, wherever you sit, city to city, and then of course within all of those, and so even within the city itself. So I just want to say that a lot of my examples might come from the US. I'll try to feed in the global perspective as well. But it really does, there are so many nuances that really depend on when you get down to that sort of local context and what that looks like. So again, we'll be just giving, try to give you some ideas on what this looks like, and just how complex it can be, and how, of course, how important it is to receive urgent attention right now, and especially in the way that we're rebuilding, for lack of a better word, or working through our current crisis right now. Next slide, please. All right, so let's break this down. I think with climate justice, it's a lot of, or just in general, to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And while the impact and likelihood of not mitigating climate change enough becomes an increasing concern. And while we're seeing unprecedented action by local and state governments, especially in the US, in the absence of national action, by businesses and local governments, we know it's not enough. And so what that's creating is a series of climate impacts felt disproportionately by communities and globally, And so really these impacts we're looking at physical impacts, as I mentioned before, so extreme weather events, drought, flooding, what have you. And that is really what we're seeing, is that these are felt disproportionately by different communities, and it's because they face these existing inequality or equity challenges before that are then exacerbated by the climate crisis. And so it's not that people don't experience these events at the same time, it's just that there are different challenges that they already face that are created by inequalities and other issues. And this really results in access issues. So we're looking at access to jobs, homes, mobility, health, livelihoods, natural resources, in some cases globally, food and water. And so this really is really the underlying sort of challenge that we have here. And what you see on the screen here are some of the communities that do tend to face these challenges or disproportionate impacts across the globe, namely women, Black, Indigenous people of color, which is definitely, I know, a US term, people with disabilities, the elderly, children, and of course these can overlap as well. So it's not necessarily that all women or all people with disabilities or all children, it's just that there can be overlapping communities here. And also one thing I'd like to highlight is just that access to resources, and so poor populations or under-resourced populations often bear the brunt of this. And so again, I can give you some examples. For in the US, Black and Indigenous people of color, we have things like lower household incomes, and so you have systemic economic and political factors in the US that are resulting in significantly lower median household incomes that then make it less able or make decision making. So some of these things are some of the things that people in the US might face that might make them less able to prepare for an event. Or just giving you an example for women, again, some of those are very similar. Again, same kind of sort of lack of access to decision making, having a voice in decision making, which we saw during Hurricane Katrina, which was in 2005. So it's actually not a recent example, but it's a very clear example where we saw women and children of people of color that were affected most. They were actually the ones that were created, that lost their homes, and then also experienced violence against themselves, or violence against women was a big factor in many of the. Wanted to also just add that globally, this might look different in a country like Bangladesh, for example. So it experiences flooding and extreme weather events very greatly. So it's almost like a big floodplain. And so what you have there is, but even as simply as not being allowed to learn how to swim, and so or the elderly and can't get out of the house in time. And so that's just a different sort of nuance there that looks different from country to country, but just showing that it is something that happens in wealthy countries as well as developing countries. Next slide, please. Mentioned earlier, and I've just talked actually quite a lot about how there's air pollution, many others that disproportionately exacerbate things like systemic inequality. Transitioning to the net zero greenhouse gas emissions economy that we know we need, that will require that alternative energies, this transition can actually risk leaving behind workers and communities that are dependent on those industries for jobs and livelihoods. And so there's an element there where when we're transitioning away from these technologies and these industries, we need to make sure that those communities are protected. The other piece of this is actually within the development and procurement of renewable energy as well, which isn't something that as we start to see the development of renewable energy, and we're starting to see things like just how that's deployed. And so there are things where there's a land issue, and so there could be land grabs taken away from people that are on that land. There's also an element there where renewable energy supply chains require mining of metals and other precious metals for solar PV cells and EV batteries, just things that actually we need for renewable energy, which then actually risk poor working condition and labor rights within the supply chain of renewable energy. There's also one last element, well, actually not one last element I'd like to highlight. We also know that when we're moving away from the fossil fuel energy to the green energy sector, renewable energy sector, we're moving away from, or we're starting with a very predominantly male industry. And so if you look at the energy sector writ large, it's very predominantly male. And so how can we, when we're moving toward these low carbon energies or renewable energies, how can we make sure that there's a new paradigm that involves other people like women? How can we make sure we're looking at equity and inclusion around people of color and providing jobs? So I think that's just like one other element I wanted to highlight. This, of course, is not the full spectrum. Next slide, please. That have been around for a very long time, but also that we're seeing right now really is intertwined with environmental justice. So it's not just the climate crisis, but it's also how, I guess when I say movement, I mean like climate justice, environmental justice movement has really been around for decades. Facilities that emit toxins into the air and water, fossil fuels can emit other harmful air pollution, especially coal. And so the pollution across the US. Been focused on the conservation of land and animals, which is that the impact on people, this disproportionate impact on certain groups of people has been completely left out of the conversation in terms of the global movement, or sort of like the broad movement. Of course, there are groups and people that have been working on this for years and years and years, but it really hasn't been the predominant focus. The focus has been around reducing emissions for everyone and hoping that that sort of like trickles down, reaching, benefiting all, but we know that's not how it works. So that's just something that is really important to sort of recognize about how the climate movement has been sort of born, and why we see this and why it's been left out for so long. Next slide, please. So why is climate justice important for business? Apart from the fact that hopefully I've painted the picture that it is the right thing to do and the right thing to act on. I think it's important to dive into what we would call the sort of like the business case for action, like why and how and why is it important for business to act on this. Next slide, please. First of all, and I spoke about this a bit earlier, it is becoming a priority for sustainable business. And so apart from crisis, noting the social justice movements, it's gaining a ton of traction. And we're coming out around how renewable energy was being deployed, and that it was sort of missing this whole human. In early this year, even within one of the coalitions that BSR has started with 9 other companies, the transition to net zero, it was something that companies really wanted to put at the sure that we're doing this in a way that respects human rights and that like puts people at the center. We've also seen just at this climate week in 2020 in September, we saw Starbucks come forward with a very clear goal and mission to put climate justice at the center of their climate activities. And so it was definitely a broader movement to really put justice throughout their sustainability work, but knowing that this has been missing from the climate work and the climate community for so long, they really have put forward a goal and a mission to do that. And just all the conversations that we're having with business right now, we anticipate that this is just going to grow and grow. And what I hoped would look like this commitment's coming forward over the next year or so. Next slide. And we know that ignoring climate change can be a material risk, but I wanted to highlight a few of the nuances that really bring this climate justice perspective in. I've talked a lot about the physical climate impacts, but these can create infrastructure damage, logistical challenges for getting goods and services around, straight through to how employees are affected, how they can get to work. And for example, if you had an extreme weather event hit a town or region or community, and though that community really holds a business, for example, it's that community is really there for either a factory or a farm or even just a business writ large, and they can't get to work, then you can't do your business. And so really understanding that element of not only just how your infrastructure is affected, but how the surrounding communities are affected, what that looks like for your business. That's something we're seeing, and it's definitely something that can be a risk. Again, increasing heat waves can make it more difficult for employees to work outside if you have a farming business or just a business where construction, for example. So we're definitely seeing companies that with the recent heat waves of the last 5 years that are having trouble even just like keeping good working environments for their employees around those kinds of impacts. It can also affect really the entire value chain if you're looking at vital communities that are important for sourcing. They're asking companies to step up and to do things on climate change, and they're also asking to step up that there is a reputational risk there for not really taking this seriously. We're seeing an increase in international norms and agreements. I've already mentioned the Paris Agreement, but the Paris at the center of that goal. There's also an element of the Paris Agreement that outlines how the transition should be done. It's an international agreement that every country has signed that really places communities and people at the center. Really, that we're seeing an increase of litigation around this. This is predominantly at high emitters, companies that have high emissions, especially around oil and gas and carbon majors. But it's something that we are seeing increasingly around litigation, and that companies being human rights there and not violating any of the communities that really depend on that land or are affected by the renewable energy deployment. Next slide, please. And so this is something I don't want to get too much into, but really just noting that adding this climate justice lens can increase impact both for climate work and also the social justice work. And so they can really increase the impact both ways by adding the is probably and really should only be the only test case that we're seeing in terms of responding to a crisis. And so whether this next crisis that we see down the road, whether it's from the climate crisis or whether it's another pandemic or something else, this is the time to really rebuild and make sure that we're rebuilding in a way that it makes us resilient for future crises. And so making sure that we're really looking at how crises can affect us down the line, and the interconnectedness is so important. Next slide, please. Also not going to get into every single nuance on this slide, but just wanted to show that climate justice responses can really unlock business benefits. Some of them I've already sort of mentioned around protecting community livelihoods, protecting employees, building stakeholder confidence, again, building reputation, and making sure that doesn't become a risk down the road. Some of the other elements on here around finance as well, like making sure that your goods and services, your supply chains, your products are protected against climate impacts, including that that people element that I was explaining earlier on the last slide. So this is just showing that there are many business benefits that can be unlocked by this, apart from that moral argument that I noted earlier. Next slide, please. So finally, what can business do about this? What are the things that you can actually do? And now that we understand climate justice and why it's important, it's really important to get into that aspect. And so we'll just move on to the next slide. There are so many things, and so I unfortunately can't get into the full spectrum of what you could do as a business or what we can even do as individuals. But right now we do have this being able to act within your own business, integrating climate justice into climate policies, programs, supplier initiative, products, which I know would be extremely important for Mozilla as a product and technology. Company reporting transparently, but really just understanding that there is an element there that can be done within your own business and within businesses writ large. Second, really thinking about how to enable others to do the same, catalyzing new opportunities to build relationships and collaborate with stakeholders, other partners and peers across the value chain. Really thinking about how you can use products to help customers and others do this as well. That's one, the sort of second element. And third, influencing. So really influencing on those barriers that are the sort of systemic injustices that certain groups face, to be able to respond and prepare for climate impacts, and sort of enable others to do the same, and influencing the policies that governments are doing. That's like, those are the three sort of chunks that we can work together on. Next slide, please. So again, this is probably pretty high level, but what can we actually do in terms of, and then therefore impact important stakeholders? I think that's the key thing, and that's really looking at the physical climate impacts, understanding what's at risk for your business, understanding what your communities look like, and what that might do and the disruptions you might face, as well as your workers, your employees. That's sort of number one. There are things you can do internally around providing trainings to employees around climate justice, and also just in terms of responding to climate impacts, depending on where you're located. Engaging those most vulnerable to climate impacts. That's such an important piece of this when we're looking at the community. Bring down these barriers to help remove the systemic inequality. Completing the necessary human rights are procuring renewable energy, whether it be through and that's really just a term for how you can buy renewable energy, as a company, to make sure that is respected there. Another thing that can be done, again, pollution areas. And so I mentioned earlier that in the US and many other places that we see neighborhoods of that are situated in these areas that have high pollution from the sort of dirty energy off the grid, and clean energy in those areas is another way that a company can enabling. This is again same. There's a huge supply chain element here, so really enabling suppliers to build resilience for their people throughout their operations. And so this can look like factory workers, smallholder farmers, what have you, really just making sure that those suppliers are enabled and that there's help there from the company to be able to protect people. Expanding operational climate resilience into vulnerable communities. So really beyond just your four walls, like I said, and beyond sort of like your operations, but into communities that you know, or that we know need a little bit of extra help because they're just not in technology. I think this is a big thing to really help customers or can deliver some of these climate justice element to this. And I mean, this for example, this webinar that I'm giving today is a really good example of really building the awareness of what this looks like and what can be done. And so that is just key and things here. It could be around influencing underlying socioeconomic inequalities. I've spoken about this, quite a lot throughout this presentation so far, but really influencing populations to be able to receive things like access to finance and healthcare and decision-making power. The list really does go on. And so lots of different examples and how this can be done. But again, the geographical nuances are important here, but really trying to influence that to be able to bring down those barriers or get rid of the systemic sort of inequalities that they face. I've already mentioned building awareness, and so there was the internal aspect, but there's also this external aspect as well. Advocating for laws that protect jobs and ensure social equity. There's a just transition piece. as well as advocating for more low carbon policies, energy policies. It's still not something that is easily accessible across even the US, and state to state this varies. And so really being able to advocate for that and get financial incentives to just promote that transition is sort of number one, and having strong climate goals. Next slide, please. I thought it was just important to note sort of some of the companies that are in climate and communities, although climate justice is a new area. And so when we start looking at things like programs that build the resilience of maybe smallholder farmers across the globe, in certain communities that maybe experience climate impacts more, that is definitely at the intersection of people and climate. But we're really seeing it's nascent in terms of actual like climate justice projects and programs from corporations. I mentioned Starbucks. I'll go into a little bit more detail into what they're doing. Just in September, they announced this, and I suspect we'll see more and more from them over the coming months. But it's within their commitment to a resource positive future that they are recognizing the inequitable vulnerabilities, that's their language, but really those inequities that I was talking about earlier of climate change within their communities across their value chain. They are developing a climate justice lens for their renewable energy and infrastructure to make sure that those human rights are protected. They're linking social justice and sustainability within their business model resiliency. And they are also advocating for change, and so that the advocating part is very strong with them, and they are speaking out publicly about this and trying to enact change within governments as well. Orsted, which is probably a company you may not have heard about, but I think it's sort of the poster child of really transitioning away from oil and gas. Like they are a Danish company, and they used to be entirely oil and gas and coal, and have successfully started their transition to become nearly 100% green power and heat by 2025. And so this is really, and really get rid of some their fossil fuel. They've really just divested from their fossil fuel unions and workers and communities to make sure that this is done in a way that's protecting their employees and communities. And so they really are a wonderful example of how this can be done within the oil and gas sector. And I have the question mark here for the last one because I can't actually tell you who they are yet, but we're currently working with a US technology company that is assessing how they can build the resilience of communities across the US that are most affected to the climate crisis. And this is looking at physical climate disasters, as I had said, and so how can they really look at some of those populations and those communities across the US that really are impacted by this like quite strongly, as well as air pollution. And so they're really trying to look at how they can off the grid and developing and access to renewable energy for some of these communities that are greatly affected. So I think those are just 3 examples. I will move on to the next slide, and I believe that's the next slide, and then we can get into some questions and discussion. This is just to show that we have done quite a lot of research at this intersection of people and climate change. These reports that you see on the screen are actually from 2018, so it's quite dated. And that's one thing I wanted to add, is just that this work is moving, and this movement is moving so quickly, and we are seeing in sort of an unprecedented I guess, engagement by all actors, and even just the data and what's available to know how this crisis is affecting people. But these reports do sort of get into and dive into some of the details on some of these things I just mentioned. So we have a just transition report, and one that looks at inclusive economy, one that looks specifically at human rights, and women, report on women and health. And so if you do want to know more, I encourage you to look at these reports, but I also just encourage you to look at some of the other reports that are coming out by some of these actors that have been working on this for some time, like the Business and Human Rights Center, and there are many others. But I think I'll stop there. I know it's 40 past the hour, so that leaves us some time for questions and discussion. And yeah, thanks so much. You can go to the next slide and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was amazing. And as usual, like I took a bunch of notes, right? So that's amazing. Thank you for that. And we already do have one from Roxy, actually, unless she wants to ask it herself. But like we are into carbon neutral themselves. But you mentioned that a little of what we can do to enable others, but maybe we can pay a bit more attention for how can we make that happen in a scalable way, right? How do you reach that?
Gosh, Roxy, that's a big. So I'll just speak from experience, sort of like to use what you have already to start with where you are. And I know thinking about the resources you had in the past as programs, because they were around like what we're doing business as usual, using the business that you have, using the technology at its. I know that's what I'm trying to. The point I'm trying.
Approach for how we scale that in. Prep yourself. It's the climate program that have worked well in other markets. So is there a way for us to?
Well, I'm not sort of framing it in the climate narrative. Any disasters over the last like couple of years. I mean, those kinds of facts, 10, potentially 20, 30 years, even just I was there, and there were certain populations that were affected more than others, and the numbers are there. And so as well with the fires, I mean, the same thing is happening with fires around the West Coast, and that like some people are able to, the wealthy are able to then go to their vacation homes or just go rent an Airbnb on, in a different state, for example. And so I think like really showing those kinds of challenges without bringing in that sort of overarching climate narrative is helpful, and can be helpful. There's probably a lot there that isn't coming to mind, but I mean, I think that's the big piece there is sort of ignoring that, the climate issue, which is really difficult for me to say out loud, but and then framing it within sort of like those disasters and those challenges. And I know that energy security is something that's always been part of the narrative for the US, and just being able to like, be able to depend on our own sort of energy, just showing that. I think there's a really amazing example of the state of Texas, which has actually deployed unbelievable amounts of wind energy because they actually saw the business benefit there. They were actually able to profit off that. And so showing the profits, showing the price comparisons of how solar and wind is now actually comparable to some of these other fossil fuel prices, and not as volatile. I mean, we've seen extreme volatility throughout the COVID crisis with the prices of fossil fuels. So those are some of the, hopefully that gives you some idea of like some of the narratives that can work in that framing.
Thank you so much. And also the question asker is saying
Mozillions, right? Like the tough questions. And that's
yeah, you learned that in January during All Hands, right? When we kept you for like an hour longer than scheduled. So we're not going to do that today, I promise. But I'll just ask you one more around the pandemic. You touched upon this a little, but do you see the disruptions that the pandemic is causing, because it's causing that across the globe, more as an opportunity or as an additional challenge to introduce systemic level transformation to actually get to where we need? Because the scale we need in terms of transformation is unprecedented, right? So is it an opportunity or is it making things harder? What's your take on that?
Gosh, well, it's 100% an opportunity, and I would say that we should be building stuff like green jobs, and really like there should be with the packages that are like government stimulus packages, for example, that should be building in some of these things to really rebound our economy and make sure that it's resilient, to the climate crisis, and taking advantage of that. So I think, yes, 100% it is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to bring, so for example, even we see the same populations that are disproportionately affected, right? And so that's another sort of way to show this, like being able to, bring that to light with this pandemic is really such an opportunity. I think it does make it challenging, but I will say that I'm really sort of unbelievably impressed by the business response to the climate crisis. Even still, we, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were worried. We were worried that this was going to shift. This was going to shift resources, or just to respond to this, to respond to this current crisis. But I think businesses have stayed strong on their commitments to climate, and local governments have stayed strong on their commitments to climate. So I think that yes, there is a risk, and some have been able to do more, and some have been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis more than others as well. So I can't say that it's across the board, but I think that it's really clearly put an opportunity for us to really start creating the systemic transformation that we know we need, and we know that actually wasn't in place to be able to even respond to this crisis. So doesn't mean that there won't be challenges, but I think like this is really, as I said before, this is the test case. We're not going to get another test case I hate calling it a test case because it is a real crisis, but it is a test case to be able to prepare ourselves for what we know is coming down the pike. No matter what we do on climate, we know that there are going to be more climate impacts no matter what. So yeah.
And obviously we're not at the end of the questions, so thank you for that. There's another one around lessons learned from vernacular communities across the world, because they have an experience with reading climate patterns and how to mitigate them, right? We're already seeing that. So how can we uplift those voices to really learn lessons that have already been learned rather than starting anew?
Yeah, I think so. That is a key element, and that was a piece of what I was saying around engaging these communities, not only to just make sure that what you're doing or what you want to do is actually what's going to help them, but also then to learn from them. I think that is, especially when you look at some of these, and take for them, for example, they've lived on these islands for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they've been able to deal with these really intense storms and storm surges and really just drought and unpredictability, right? With a very limited amount of resources on their island. And they've actually been able to do that and create ways to be able to do that. And so the more we can learn from them, I think is better. And there are companies that are starting to look at even just their smallholder farmers, so agricultural companies that have these sort of large agricultural supply chains and reach these small communities across like places in for example, like Western Africa with cocoa beans. And they're starting to actually look at the traditional knowledge that these people have been using for so long and understand that like they actually know more a lot of the time than we do. They know how to read the weather patterns as well. So I think, how can we lift them up? I mean, I think like part of it is really, as a company, understanding where those communities sit within your entire value chain, and really like diving into that, engaging them, but engaging them in the right way. So engaging them with local partners is essential, because the local partners often understand they understand the community and the context, and they understand how to engage with them, and that is just key. So I think that's the first thing, is like, as a business, understanding where those communities sit, as well as understanding how to engage with them. But I think I think that is just like something that we haven't done enough of and need to do more of. But there are lots of groups and communities that work on this and are willing to partner and are willing to lift these voices up. We just have to, as the people that sort of have the power to lift them up, like really provide that platform and space to be able to do that.
Thank you so much. And from the externally facing questions, we also have some focused on what can we as Mozilla do. One of the questions is importance of lowering the threshold to actually participate in our sustainability efforts, right? So question is, have you seen other companies promote programs like the one that we're currently running in a more fun and interesting way? So like, what would be strategies to make it more playful? And guess what? It's another question from Roxy, because she likes playfulness.
So the question is around how to make like this sort of new era of working remotely more fun, right? Is that the question?
How to ease the threshold to engage in sustainability efforts across the company.
And making sustainability more fun. Well, gosh, isn't it already so much fun? No, I think, I think the employee engagement and that piece of it is something that often actually isn't, we don't see a lot of it, but we're seeing more and more, just because, again, like I said, like your employees and are unbelievably smart and talented people that have like lots of ideas and passion to do this. And so I think, so really making sure that engagement is open and sort of there's a platform to do that is really important. Making it more fun, gosh, I don't, I'm not really sure. I mean, there are tons of games you can play actually around this. So the Red Crescent Center actually publishes, I think they publish books on this to really break down some of these like extremely complex issues and the science and some of the nuances into like tangible games that you can play with your employees. And so I think that's like, we've played a lot of these games at a lot of the conferences I've gone to, and it really does make it fun, and it does break it down. I think that's often like the hardest thing for people is they sort of have a wall there when somebody says climate. They're like, I have no idea what that, I'm not a climate person, but I think like breaking it down. The other thing that I'll just say is that I think also understanding that, like, especially when we're talking about what we're talking about today, this sort of like equity challenges and how the climate crisis really exacerbates these equity challenges, you don't have to be a climate expert. And I think like that's the first thing, is that like understanding how to act on this doesn't mean you have to be an expert. Actually, like you just have to understand that there are just like these basic challenges, the basic equity challenges. Climate exacerbates them. So it's really about understanding those equity challenges, the local context, like those kinds of things, versus like being a climate expert. And for the things where you're talking about like data analysis, there are experts that do that, and you shouldn't necessarily try to become the expert on that. I would say like really thinking about ways to like bring the people in that you have, you know, access to, your employees, your passionate employees, for example, is really like where you should be spending time and energy and sort of helping them understand these things, versus like sort of those like extreme nuances that really are only a fraction of it in terms of acting on this.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking at the time, so I'm only going to ask you one last question to basically send us off, which is more personal. And I also, just before we sign off, I want to say thank you to the AV team for making everything run smoothly. They always work their magic in the background. That's amazing. So like one of the things that I want to kick you off on, and I hope you're going to inspire some hope, but that's just my personal thing. Like, it's very complex. I think you made that very clear. Intersectionality, everything's interconnected. And I'm sure you also sometimes have low days where you're like, oh, how do I tackle that? So how do you keep motivated? And how do you continue facing something that is so incredibly complex and just sometimes utterly overwhelming?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're right. There are good days and bad days, right? I mean, I think it's just sort of the constant. So one, I think it's just that like we don't really have another choice, and so I know that's not a very good answer, but I just that is the case. I do see this. I see the disasters around the world. I see what's happening. It's just we don't have another choice. The other thing that's really inspiring is just the amount of action and the activity that has actually happened over the last even 20 years. I mean, it feels like we're taking a really long time to do this, but when we're looking at the actual problem, the systemic transformation that needs to happen, we've actually come quite far. And even just from 2015 with the Paris Agreement, and where I saw where business was, for example, at that point, where we had very few companies coming forward, setting really ambitious targets. And where we are now, where we have like, I mean, I think it's around 1,300 companies that have set like really ambitious science-based targets. And then we have another handful that have set targets to be in line with the most ambitious part of the Paris Agreement. So I look at that, like that, the amount of activity that's happened in the last 5 years, and it actually makes me feel like we can do this, which is, it's a difficult thing, because if you sit and you look around yourself today at what's happening, it's really difficult to find that. But if you look at the progress of what we've made within the climate movement, even compared to other movements, like we've actually come quite far. And so we can't stop now. We've got to keep going. And I think like we've got a lot of people on board to make this happening, including, you know, yourselves, like including very powerful people, you know, whether they're in government or businesses or other parts of the community. Like people want to make this happen. So yeah, so hopefully that's inspiring.
Thanks so much. It's been a great pleasure as always. It's really Always fantastic to hear and learn from you. Thank you so much for taking the time. And we'll just, I mean, I know I get to talk to you again, so I'm very pleased about that. But anyone else, if there's still open questions, do feel free to ping me and I can always convey them to Sam so we can continue the conversation. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Sam, and have a good day.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.